I worked as the lieutenant's clerk at High Desert on B Yard for a little over a year before I eventually rolled up and went SNY. I've done a video about essentially how I got the job before, but I don't think I went into any depth about exactly what the job entailed and the fact that to an outside observer, the administrative clerk position looks a lot like a paid rat. You have to figure that I sat in an office with a half dozen officers for hours at a time. I read the same paperwork they did. That most inmates are prohibited from being alone with an officer under any condition, and that my job entailed all day long alone with multiple officers. I knew what gang investigations were going on sometimes, and I always read the rules violation reports before the inmates that the reports were dealing with got copies. Of course, in reality, the shot callers on the yard were very glad to have me in this position. It's an important position to have an inmate in, and it's nothing to do with informing on other inmates. In fact, your job essentially amounts to being an editor. You see a lot of correctional officers, they're not very highly educated. There are a lot of high school dropouts. All you need is a GED in order to work in corrections. But a lot of the paperwork that they have to prepare has to be good enough that it could be presented in a judicial setting. Every report that's prepared is signed by the warden. It's signed by the chief disciplinary officer of the prison. And in many cases, these reports address serious wrongdoing, gang investigations, and are used in actual court hearings in the future. So they tend to find an inmate who's reasonably literate and employ him with the job of reading the reports and correcting grammar, syntax, spelling, this type of thing. Of course, it's always a trade-off, because if the cops had their way, they would just walk in and say, hey, Clerk Channel, I want you to write up a report where I'm writing up inmate Franco for being out of bounds this afternoon. Just go ahead and make it up. It's good enough. That's not okay. It's not okay for me as an inmate, because inmate Franco might take that personally, and it's not okay for him as a correctional officer, because he actually has a duty to report what he saw, not just give a 3-word synopsis and have an inmate make it up. Whenever reports didn't meet the standard that they should in order for me to make them look right, it was my job to take them to the lieutenant and say, hey, LT, can you get at the officer and make him, fill in some details, make this thing look a little better? I can't write the whole report for him, nor should I. There's one occasion which stands out as just the worst written report that I saw in the entirety of my incarceration. I'll never forget it. An officer walked in and handed me a piece of paper, and it was the correct form. He'd filled out all the boxes, what his job was, what time the stuff had happened, who the inmates involved were. And then whenever it got to the part of the report where he described what happened, he had written, verbatim, they was over, by, under, next to the soccer ball net, doing that thing I told them not to do. I didn't read this until after he'd left the room, or I might have given it back to him and said he needed to fill in some details, that this wasn't a report of any kind of wrongdoing, this was just a narrative of something that happened on a Tuesday. Instead, I took it to the lieutenant, I handed it off to him and said, hey LT, I can't do this. Well, what am I supposed to do with this? And the lieutenant got a little excited. He went, oh, I've been waiting for this guy to do this report. This is important. Here, I'll clean it up, I'll talk to him, we'll give you an actual report later in the day. Later in the day came around, and the thing he had described, it had happened kind of over, by, under, next to the soccer ball net, by which he meant next to the soccer ball net. The thing he told them not to do was a stabbing. This report was about an assault with a deadly weapon that had happened on the yard the day before. I don't know exactly what he told them not to do. I would hope it was, hey, you guys don't stab each other over, by, under, next to the soccer ball net. So I cleaned up the report and I wrote it the way that it was supposed to after the lieutenant filled in the blanks and told me what it was supposed to say, and I went back to my cell that day, and I gotta be honest, I was feeling a little smug, maybe even a little arrogant. Gosh, these dumb cops, they can't spell or read or write. I'm so much better than they are. Went back to my cell and I got one of my textbooks that I had set aside so I could feel really smart. Maybe I was studying math or English or whatever it was. And I sat by my window eating my top ramen soup and looked out in the parking lot to see all of the very well-paid correctional officers getting on their Harleys and their brand new trucks and leaving to go home to their wives and families, while I ate my top ramen soup and studied my textbook, patting myself on the back because I was the genius. I was the smart guy. They were the dummies. The point that I'm trying to make here is that if there's something that you do well, be it education, physical fitness, keeping your temper in difficult scenarios, showing up to work every day on time for your whole life, whatever the thing might be, don't fool yourself into thinking that it makes you better than other people who can't do it, because they have their own things that they do better than you. I sure was feeling like a smart guy who knew how the world worked, sitting in my 10 by 12 box eating my top ramen soup. But the fact of the matter was, I was being a dummy. I wasn't being a dummy because I was in that box. I was being a dummy because I thought I was better than somebody else just because I could read and write better than they could. That's real arrogance.